We have too many people here today, which is a great thing to do, individual intros, but we do want to see everybody that's on. Today, we're really excited. We've got Julie Sweetland with us to kick off a series around framing. So Julie is a sociolinguist and serves as a senior fellow with the Frameworks Institute, which uses social science to study how people understand social issues and then use those evidence-based techniques to help people like us communicate more effectively. So I'm really just going to turn this over to Julie to run the show, but I do want to put a plug in that this is a two-part series. So today is kind of the introduction to frameworks, and then we're going to do a part 2 with Julie around communication traps on Wednesday, May 19th at noon. So save the date. We will be sending out more information about that and registration. But I just wanted to make sure everyone knew that this was a two-part series. So with that, I'm going to turn it on over to Julie and take it away.
Thank you so much, Mary. And thanks for everyone for making some time in your busy day to have this conversation. I'm looking forward to it. As mentioned, my name is Julie. I'm here today on behalf of the Frameworks Institute. We are a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. We work nationally and internationally. We're a group of social scientists. We come together to study the communications aspects of different social and scientific issues. So our mission is to help folks like you achieve your mission through the power of framing. Our theory of change is that if we as the nonprofit sector can be very careful and intentional in our communication, if we change what we say, that affects public discourse. It shapes what people hear. And that's really important because the number one predictor, not the only predictor, but the number one predictor of what people will believe is the number of times they have heard it. So if we can come together and use shared language and effective framing strategies, that can really have a big impact on public opinion and thinking and understanding of social issues. And that matters not only so that people can make more informed decisions in their own lives, but so they can really live out their role as an informed citizen as part of the political and policy making process that places pressure and demand and incentives on policymakers to do the right thing. And when I talk about policy, I mean the decision of any group to act or not to act. So certainly that can be big P policy and big P politics, but we work much more so in the kind of in the systems that shape us and surround us all. And so any kind of group decision, right, to prioritize something or to fail to act, the way the public thinks about that issue will shape those decisions, whether or not they're made, and if whose interest are they made in, and what solutions do we pursue. So we work really hard at getting that beginning circle right, really using research to figure out what is the most effective thing to say, what is the thing that will travel through public discourse, move thinking in the way we want it to go, and set people up for policy thinking and set up a conversation that leads to the policies that evidence is pointing us to. So example of where framing, why the meta frame, the larger narrative on an issue makes a difference. Probably the kind of the best known case study in framing literature and also in public health in particular is on the reframing of tobacco. So before, in the from the nation's founding actually until maybe around the 1960s, tobacco was framed as a vice. A personal choice, right? Something that individuals chose to do or not to do. And in that sense, the tobacco industry was really lifted up as a vital industry, essential to our nation's founding, key to state economies, all that sort of stuff. In terms of if it caused a social problem, that was seen as smokers' own poor choices. Addiction was a regrettable situation, but a personal failing. And who bears responsibility for this social problem or for this problem to the extent that it's a problem? Well, it's a private problem. It's up to parents to instill values, and the solutions coming out from the highest levels of the government, right, through the 1980s were protect yourself, right? Just say no. Whereas, starting in the 1960s and advocates working very intentionally and very strategically to reframe that issue and really talk about tobacco not as any old thing that people can decide to pick up or not to pick up, but really as a defective product and that framed the industry not as a job creator, but as a disease creator, right? They're a deviant industry. And as advocates shone a light on different manipulative tactics that industry was using, whether that is manipulating the chemical composition of the tobacco products or other racially targeted advertising, et cetera. Really that changed the values proposition. So what's at stake? A lack of choice. We're taking away people's freedom by adding addictive substances, and the bad behavior is no longer in the smokers, it's on the companies. Addiction is therefore reframed. It's a result of corporate manipulation. And this framing sets up a very different sense of who's responsible, who are the actors that should be working on a problem. It becomes the responsibility of government to regulate this defective and dangerous product. And so the kinds of solutions that follow from that are protective policies, limiting advertising, removing ability to put things in kids' eye lines, et cetera. So that whole meta frame moves the conversation from fix the people to fix the conditions. We can hear there are other examples in recent memory, the reframing of marriage equality being a prime example that probably many of you as communications pros have dug into. There again, a big shift from rights to love, right? And that sets up a whole different story of what what the solutions that we're willing to consider. So I am going to talk today more about framing those higher level decisions. And I just want to point out, because I know I'm among a group of comms nerds, that this is a little distinct from messaging. Not always in tension. Ideally, framing and messaging kind of are complementary and working together, but there are some points where they are in tension. So one fundamental to keep in mind is the distinctions and tensions and synergies between framing and messaging. Framing, as I said, involves the big picture choices about the kinds of arguments we're making across communications, the values we're using, the types of explanations we're offering, choices about what aspects of the issue to foreground and which to background. And messaging is about particular choices in specific communications context, the very precise words and images we employ, for example. So a big picture frame that's very present in our culture right now is this theme and a frame of reconstruction. And then a message that expresses that frame is build back better, right? And you would have lots of different messages that are getting into this idea of returning, right? And fixing what has been broken in the last year. So you can see how these differences play out in the table. Of course, they're not as separate as a two-column format suggests. Again, framing can and should be threaded through messaging, and you definitely want your messaging to be lifting up your higher frame. But framing is about driving the public narrative in a new or productive direction. Doesn't necessarily have to be new. In order to do that, it needs to be consistent over a long period of time. Remember, the number of times people have heard something shapes the thinking. So you need that consistency. By its very nature, that makes it a longer term process and outcomes. Whereas in messaging, again, it's a specific moment, a specific goal. After this meeting, I want people to, right, think about things differently. And the first question you need to ask then is, who's my audience, so that you can tailor the message to that particular group and move them to that particular action. That makes it a somewhat shorter term process and outcomes. So the tools we reach for, whether we're framing or messaging, are slightly different, can be slightly different. So in framing, we're looking for the larger themes, the values, the overall explanation or our narrative about what this issue is about, who's responsible, what's the fix. In messaging, you're looking at for that crystallizing story, the perfect turn of phrase, right? The call to action for that moment. And so the way you do those work is, in framing, it's really important to coordinate narratives and positioning, not only across your own organization, but across your allies and across a field. Whereas in messaging, if you're lucky, you are just, herding the cats in a smaller kind of more discreet sort of thing, figuring out who am I talking to, when does this thing need to go out that day. So just keep that in mind. And that I think that having this distinction in mind can help us spot, it's not that this messaging is bad. The colors look great, it's catchy, but the frame of this is not what we want, and to think about that. So I'll show you how today a lot of messaging that is or is not lifting up the kind of frame I think a progressive set of advocates might want to do. So with that, I'll go through these 4 today, and I want to encourage you all to add comments and questions to the chat throughout. I might pause and be able to take some as we go, but that will get us seated for a good conversation along. So just feel free to chat as we're going along. It won't distract me over much, but I'm going to walk through these 4. Think of framing as a set of choices. Tell complete stories. Really emphasize explanation. I think there are lots of things that go into framing. If I had to pick one superpower, it would be explanation. And then repeat, repeat, repeat without sounding repetitive. All right, so framing as a set of choices. So often, I just showed you what is a frame, what does it do, vice versus defective product. And so people often want, what is that thing, right, that I need to switch? What is that one discrete thing? And sometimes in retrospect, you can see that. But in the course of crafting a particular communication or a campaign, there's usually not just a single switch you can flip. It's a little more like this thing, which, if you know your nautical history, is a sextant, right? That sailors used to use to navigate towards an intended destination. I think the technical name for those little bits are doohickeys, and you need to fidget with all the doohickeys in a communication in order to really get it going, right, toward that larger narrative. So let me show you some of the fidgets, right? The framing fidgets that we've noticed are really important across a whole range of issues. I know you guys are a diverse bunch today. So frames, again, are sets of choices, what to emphasize, how to explain it, and what to leave unsaid. And we're looking for the adjustments that we can make that have a measurable difference, that create a measurable difference in how people understand, interpret, and act on our issues. So a lot of those things we can change. So we've seen that values, or the principles that society should uphold. Jennifer, you're staring really hard. Should I make this bigger? Is it small on everybody's screen? Sometimes I do that. Values that can help people orient to the bigger picture principles and ideals that we hold dear as a society, things that everybody agrees are good, truth and justice, those sorts of things. We can look at, sorry, I've gotten a little lost in my things here. Messengers, right? Who is giving a particular, delivering a particular message can build trust and demonstrate credibility or sink it. The visuals that we use can really bring our larger framing to life and make it instantly understandable, or it can actually hijack our entire framing and send people in another direction. So either way, it's quickly reinforcing some view of an issue. The examples that we choose can help people imagine the concrete effects of abstract problems and solutions. And our tone makes a big difference in how people will participate, right? Have we come to a civics class, or have we come to a debate stage, right? And so a sense of what kind of conversation we're having. So let me show you some examples of those sorts of things. So in a recent project on, a few years ago, we did a project on making the case for oral health as a central part of overall health and as a core health equity issue. So it turned out that among people who identified as Democrats, support was already pretty high, but among Republicans, not so much. In fact, there was about a 20-point gap in difference in their support for oral health equity policies. And that meant for us to be effective for our partners, we really needed to find a strategy that would boost support among conservatives. And we decided to experiment with the effects of positive or negative emphasis. So a negative or loss frame would emphasize that if society fails to act on oral health, we'd have economic losses and public health problems that would follow. And whereas the gain frame, accentuated the positive. If society takes action to improve oral health, then we'll have economic gains and public health improvements. We took we randomly assigned people to receive either a gain message or a loss message, and then we asked them their opinions about a range of oral health policies that would help to eliminate disparity. So these were things like including oral health and Medicaid coverage and incentivizing more dentists to actually accept Medicaid coverage. So Democrats really liked the gain message, right? The positive, they're like, yes, we're all in. They were already all in. They were all inner. But it did not move Republicans. But let's look at what did work. So this negative, the loss frame, had a really powerful, a really powerful effect. In fact, it really closed the gap, right, between Republicans and Democrats on this issue. We've replicated this on a couple of other issues. It makes sense in some way. By definition, conservatives are less bought into the idea that public policy or government, right, is the way to kind of go about addressing a social problem. So saying, hey, if we address this, it'll really work, right, isn't as resonant for them. Whereas a loss frame, like if we don't do anything, right, this is going to get worse, can kind of interrupt that default assumption. I wouldn't go so far as to say that would work on every issue or that it's generalizable. Gun control, I wouldn't try that, so much on highly politicized issues, but we have seen it on quite a few things. And so just being mindful, right, of which one are you doing, can be helpful. The gain frame is often helpful on issues that people don't have strong pre-existing opinions on. All right, so another one, tone. Different tones can elicit different responses. So I just said, don't try that on gun control, but here's something that we did find on this. So in a project recently in Missouri, which is home to the NRA National Hall of Fame and is so polarized on this issue that a state legislator a session or two ago introduced legislation to make it a felony for any legislator to even introduce legislation that could control guns. Luckily, that bill didn't go anywhere, but you see the level of polarization, right, that's operating in that state. And so our task, our analysis based on that kind of information is that the issue is a spiral of silence in that particular state, right? There are lots more people who are actually in favor of some gun safety reforms, but don't speak up because they know it's kind of a toxic issue and they don't want to get into a fight or a conversation. And so the conservatives are, even with no kind of opposition, they're more emboldened to say even more radical things. And that's how it actually helps drive the polarization. So our task was to figure out a way where people could imagine themselves speaking up, right, and having some kind of conversation on this issue. So we had small groups, got short texts. They were formatted to look like an op-ed, and they took different tones. You can see the headlines here. The first takes a highly emotional, basically outrage tone. The second took a much more scientific tone. The article was filled with phrases like, according to this study, and these figures point to. So if you'll permit me a Star Trek reference, if the first is Scotty or Worf, the second is more of a Spock Data vibe. And the third, I never know where to put Captain Kirk. Let's go with Picard, right? It's more reasonable. Reasonable people on both sides of this debate can surely set aside other differences and agree on the pressing need to save Missourians' lives by dealing with gun violence in our state. All right, so here's a summary of what we found. The outrage tone was viewed as accusatory and politically charged, even if the participants in these research settings were for gun safety reforms. They rejected it as an inappropriate for civil conversation, couldn't see themselves using it, and didn't really want to be involved in that issue. The scientific one devolved very quickly into a scientific authority debate, right? It was viewed with suspicion. Whose research? The research was, what studies were they doing? Who did they ask for? Are you sure? Who was it funded by? So the conversation got distracted by the message. It focused on science and bias, and people actually weren't talking about guns and solutions to preventing gun violence. What did work was the more reasonable tone. People described it as inclusive and getting past political beliefs. They envisioned a productive conversation following. And so that meant whichever side whichever beliefs they held, they could see themselves as being willing to engage in a conversation with someone who might have different beliefs than them, which again, in that particular campaign and that context was a really critical sort of move that we knew we needed to accomplish. So we've got positive gain framing versus loss framing, different styles of tone, meaning our emotional stance and the type of emotional reaction we think our language will evoke. Another one is images. So here, these are 3 different images that I took from 3 different coalitions or organizations who were all focused on that oral health equity issue, right? So these are groups who want to see deep structural changes in insurance and public health infrastructure and availability of culturally and linguistically competent and appropriate care. More expanding the licensure, right, for so that dental therapists and hygienists, right, can offer care, and everything is not, only the dentist, which means in rural areas you've got more care available, right? So kind of big structural changes. But we can see these images may or may not help them meet those goals, right? So the standalone bicuspid is the most common image, right? Sometimes it's an anthropomorphized bicuspid, the little guy, happy smiley guy, tooth holding a toothbrush, but that signals that it's about teeth. And that it's great because it communicates quickly, right? You know what these people are talking about, but often on social change issues, we actually need to interrupt what people bring to the issue, right? We want to slow them down and have them contemplate different associations with the topic. Can guarantee you nobody looks at that tooth and thinks we need deep structural change to Medicaid, eligibility and reimbursement and provider incentives, right? So it signals it's just about teeth. That lets people devalue the issue. We found in our research, people think, oh, it's just cosmetic, not a public issue, whereas actually the oral health people tried to tell me oral health was the social justice issue of our day. And I told them, yeah, don't ever say that again. But as I learned about it, I was like, it kind of is, like, it's deep. It goes really deep. So people are not thinking about that, though, if they're thinking about the cosmetic issue. It reinforces a division between the mouth and the body, hence reinforces the fact that we've got two different types of insurance for these things. The cute kid brushing, oral health is personal hygiene. Not fluoridation and school screening programs and preventative care widely available. It's about personal behaviors, which makes it not a public issue. And who's responsible for this cute kid? His mom and dad, right? Our social responsibility is nowhere in this image. So those two images communicate quickly. So they might be effective messaging, but I would argue that they're not effective framing. This third one really starts to get to the larger set of issues, right? That the overall story they want to tell. So oral health equity begins with fluoridation. We've got the whole body in the picture here. We've got active, healthy people. We've got a picture of water, which is, that's focusing people on the solution, right? Not on the issue. Which is your mouth, I guess, and it really is a much broader frame on things. So just thinking about whether or not your visuals are communicating quickly to your detriment or asking people to slow down and think more, rethink what they think they know about the issue is one place that we see framing help. So if the overall set here is think about a set of choices, I hope I've had you see kind of the range of choices of things that you might consider. Second main point or framing fundamental is to tell a complete story. And by story, I'm not talking about kind of little picture, anecdotes or human interest sorts of examples, but what is, again, that larger policy narrative on your issue? How are you going to define the problem? How are you going to explain how it comes about? What are you saying about what needs to be done to improve the situation? I love this quote. Policy narratives contain explicit and implicit ideas about what's wrong and how to put it right. And so those sorts of things of the problem definition, the cause, and the solution are really critical to include. We often teach that kind of narrative structure through the 4 Ps. A principle, a process, a problem, and a proposal. And I'll happily send this along as a handout when I distribute the slides. But to lead with an ideal that a society should uphold. So whether that's, we can see examples of this in terms of, right, if a conversation we're all having right now is race or experience of race, right, in America, one principle that's been very effectively messaged right now or framed is that Black Lives Matter, right? And that is a sense of humanity, right? Shared humanity is that principle, and no one's left out of the circle of lives, right? So that's leading with that principle. So tapping into some kind of higher value and a collective concern. And then offering a process. So explaining how an issue works, establishing a mechanism or a process that leads from one state to another. And so here, in the sense of this conversation around policing and inequitable policing, one process that advocates have taught very effectively is the issue of implicit bias and snap judgments, right? And there's a deeper history there as to why police may view Black bodies as more dangerous, more violent, that sort of thing, more fearful. But that's a process that shows how it works, which is gives us a place where we can interrupt the issue, right, in play. And then you want to put some tension in the plot, making social conditions or structures the bad guys. Paint these threats as important but not insurmountable. So this might be where you use data, where you use very particular examples of something, an issue gone wrong. Here, in the issue of the Black Lives Matter, example of the Black Lives Matter and policing justice issue, this is where you add the, or where advocates have been very effective in showing, right, statistics on disparities between police deaths among, white folks who interact with the police versus Black folks who interact with the police, really showing how police contracts, right, protect them from, protect police who are involved in a shooting from investigation or charging and that sort of thing. So we've got a structural problem there. And then pointing to solutions. So here, the solutions that are offered it's important on any issue, I think, to make them big picture solutions, particularly if we are raising a big social problem and offer only little picture individual level solutions. The public often turns away, or they'll do that one individual solution fix and check it off their list and move on to the next social issue. And so really pointing to solutions that really require and demand public engagement, public support, and a public conversation. That's the level of solutions that a strong issue frame will include. So to make the case for why we definitely need to do all beats of a narrative, I'm going to show you a heads up. Here comes a bar graph. Solutions, how important it is to tell that complete narrative. This is data from a study that we conducted in England, and it was on the issue of child abuse and neglect. And so we tested 3 messages. The first was social responsibility. So we all have a duty and obligation to make sure that kids in the UK are okay. And so we got this. And so in terms of, is this a major problem? High points. Is it sorry, it wasn't just kids were okay. We have a duty to make sure that they're protected from child abuse and neglect. Is a fix needed? Yes, people agreed with that, statistically significant. Can we make a difference on this issue? Yeah, we probably could, but less so. Is this a public issue? It did not accomplish that. And when you take action on this, we operationalize this in a couple of different ways. One way was intent to donate to the organization. Others were other measures. So not bad. We got a good, decent-ish bump for this type of experiment. We usually like to see things a little bit higher than that, but this is 3 out of our 5 outcomes, statistically significant results, moving in the right direction. We tested a second message, which is we have a duty to make sure that all kids in Britain are free from abuse and neglect, and 1 in 5 is actually experiencing abuse and neglect. And that was the same as saying nothing statistically. We saw a loss of support on all of those issues. But if we told a complete message, we have a duty to make sure all kids in the UK are free from abuse and neglect. 1 in 5 are experiencing or at risk. And in every England shire, state, I don't know, wherever they have hamlet, village, and every village there's a hotline, right, that you can call to if you have a concern. That, just including even a small solution like that, helped move people into the idea that yes, it's a problem. We do need to do something. We have some collective responsibility for this, and I myself will take some action on this issue. So on most issues, are not all, but on most issues, I think our challenge in framing is not to convince the public that a problem exists. It's to convince them that the problem can be solved. And so really ensuring that we are telling that complete story, that we're thinking about, what are we trying to get out of this? Is it Contract reform for police. Well, that's going to ensure, that's going to shape how I tell that story and what's the explanation and what's the value that I lift up. But really thinking about that solution you want to propose at the end, working backwards from there. If we don't include that solution or we don't frame our way toward that solution, we've taken our very limited slice of the public's attention that we get based on being social change communicators, right? Nike and Coke get way more all the time, every day. We only get a little bit of their attention. And so it's really important that we use that attention to move people to understand the kinds of proposals we need to create big change. All right, framing fundamental, I think I'm on number 3 here, emphasize explanation. I think I mentioned at the top that, there's lots and lots of different communication strategies, framing tactics that you can use. And if I had to pick one that it was a superpower, it would be explanation. Oops. We often, I think, as advocates, communicate too much like this guy, where we start off with all the risk factors and indicators and predictors, and we end up with all the outcome data and the disparities and the connection between underlying cause and visible solution, right, or visible symptom. Gets erased. We skip over that part. And part of that's because we as experts to an issue take that for granted. And we're trying to give people data to say, hey, pay attention, pay attention. But often it's well, when we do that, we leave some support on the table. And I'm going to show you that. So here's a study we did on tobacco related health disparities. And so this was an equity, health equity issue right now. The health burdens of commercial tobacco are highest in communities facing disadvantage. And that's people of color, people with lower incomes, rural people, LGBT plus, people with behavioral health conditions. And there's a real strong disparity on this issue right now. And so if we tested same sort of thing, 3-layer message. What if we just mention it? What's the effect of that? A second group got mentioning it plus name somebody who's responsible, naming the tobacco industry as responsible. So the industry has promoted their products more and we need to decrease their influence. And then the third level, third message was the 3-layer. So there's disparities. It's about tobacco industry. And let me explain how they do that. In the 70s, they were handing out free cigarettes in low-income housing and sending out tobacco. Did you know we did this as a federal government? We sent out coupons for tobaccos with food stamps, with food stamps at some point. That was actually a thing we did. And then we wonder why there are higher rates of smoking in some social classes. There's targeted marketing, particular campaigns, LGBT bar nights sponsored by tobacco companies, etc. So some real examples of how this happened. And here's what we saw. You can get people to think structurally on this issue pretty easily. So whether or not you just mentioned it or said, hey, it's the tobacco industry, or hey, it's the tobacco industry, and do you know they did that? We got a significant bump in support for policies that are particularly designed to eliminate disparities. Things like reinvesting tobacco taxes and other tobacco revenue into the communities that are most affected. But we were only able to get people to say, okay, so people would say, yes, that's a structural problem. There's a big bad guy out there. But they would only say, we need to do something about it as a society if you gave the more granular detail, right? So people could not come up with an idea of well, how do we tackle big tobacco? That's just too big for me to kind of grapple with. But over advertising and saturating some neighborhoods with ads, that I can wrap my mind around, that I can see. No, we should definitely not be giving out coupons, right? And discounts in certain neighborhoods or any neighborhood, right? So people, if you really point people to a fuller explanation, they are more willing to engage and take responsibility and believe that we can make a difference on the issue. That example that I gave you was really, really long. We did that for experimental purposes. The explanation need not be lengthy. This one I think is 40 odd words, and it does lots of the framing strategies that we recommend for this field. So we have used a visual to show an affected population, right? Young Black Black infants basically here. We have showed that a causal pathway, they're exposed to secondhand smoke and it comes through vents, doors, and windows. And we've got a collective solution here. And it's not just don't smoke in your house, right? It's talk to your landlord about making your building entirely smoke free, right? So a civic level action, right? That somebody can take, changing an institution, not just changing an individual. Here's another nice example of how building in explanation can help your constituencies get smarter about the issue and therefore not just care, but care and be better ambassadors. So in our work on climate change, we work primarily with zoo and aquarium interpreters. So the nice, lovely people who stand in front of the kelp or the polar bear or the tuna and answer, your kids' questions. We train them all to, no matter what a family comes up and asks about the kelp or the tuna, all roads lead to climate change, that they're going to engage you in a conversation about how a changing climate is affecting the ecosystem of that live exhibit. They have had over 125 million conversations about climate change with Americans in the last 8 or so years. More people go to a zoo and aquarium in the before times. When we actually went places, more people went to a zoo or aquarium each year than attend all major league sports events combined in the US. So it's a big, big platform. I cannot capture those 125 million conversations because they were happening on the floor with people with their kids, but I can show you what Polar Bears International here did, because they are kind enough to have like Twitter campaigns and stuff. So before they were using a charismatic megafauna, as people in environmental communications like to call it, a big cuddly animal that we all love, and that's the problem. And it's a little bit like that bicuspid tooth, right? What is this connected to, right? It's just the thing right there. And their call to action was SOS, right? Save our sea ice. But of course, we know that's SOS, like, save our ship and that sort of thing. So a real crisis and rescue kind of frame is what we've got there. With greater explanation, this is the kind of things they put out. So look, we've got people in the picture now, right? So polar bears eat seals, eat all these things. And that when the sea ice is messed up, it messes up this whole ecosystem. So sea ice is as important to the Arctic ecosystem as soil is to a forest. And in the end, it's important to protect this ecosystem that many species depend on. So really broadening the issue. I've got another great example for them where they kind of connect the polar bear back to the energy we're using in cities, right? So it's not just remote and that sort of thing, but just a difference, kind of the same format and channel, right? Same messenger, but the explanation is very different. All right, finally, repeat without sounding repetitive. Let me go there. Let me pull up some notes here. I can be more eloquent. So when we put our ideas on repeat, we want to put our ideas on repeat. For our ideas to break through and take hold during this noisy time, we need both discipline and inspiration. So repetition is essential. It's going to really shape understanding. But if we sound scripted, we seem inauthentic and we lose credibility. So I think the best way to manage this tension is to really focus on being good storytellers. We want to think about bringing the same fundamental frame to life in fresh ways each time. And the other hidden benefit, right, of deciding you are going to repeat is that you actually have a narrative arc. You have a thing you're going to say each time. And that means when you've got a new or time sensitive opportunity or challenge, you can turn to a trusted and effective frame. You know that you're going to show what's at stake each time by consistently expressing a motivating value that works for your issue, rather than saying, oh my gosh, I need to go and find the latest data on this issue because I need all the stark statistics that I need to motivate and move people. Preview the traps we'll be going through next time we meet are how to avoid naked numbers. It means, if you're going back, how to return again and again to those core explanations, right? That this is about implicit bias. This is about lack of access. This is about unjust and unfair practices centered on certain communities. Whatever that core explanation is you have, you can return to that again and again instead of splintering your stories and driving yourself crazy by looking for a novel response to each new development. So as we commit to being consistent, that means you also have to commit to being creative. You got to find ways to refresh and revive that enduring frame. And there's lots of ways you can do that. I'd love to hear what you all think about this in the chat. This is probably a good juicy one to dig into, but we can invite new voices to share our movement's version of our core story, or we can express our values in unexpected ways, different images to illustrate that, or timely examples of a timeless theme. All right, so here's some inspiration and insight about how an enduring frame can get expressed in multiple ways across time. So let's look at how the value of human equality, right, has been expressed really different ways, right, by really different messengers. But it's a consistent story that is getting built into, right, our shared consciousness. So 1867, you've got Sojourner Truth giving her address to the first annual meeting of the American Equal Rights Association, and her viral, tweet coming out of that 1867 thing was, "If it is not a fit place for women, it is unfit for men to be there," right? As women were getting kind of kicked out of the thing. 1948, I've got a picture of the always fabulous Eleanor Roosevelt here, but from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. We've got, we could see that same sort of thing in 1963 from Dr. King. We want all of our rights. We want them here. We want them now. So urgency as well there. And then this is just down the street from my house, the satellite view. This is a picture from space of the Black Lives Matter mural painted on the DC street that runs right in front of the White House. So really, that is the sort of thing I'm saying on repeat, repeat, repeat. Of course, if you've got a time limited campaign, you want to be consistent in that particular slogan, but what are the ideas that your cause needs to build into common sense thinking over the next 10, 20, 30 years, that level of repeat. And you can do that. I just showed you that over time, but this is in a moment, right? So we've been working very intentionally with the human services field and have done a lot of work with the Illinois Human Services Association, actually, on moving from a compassion frame, right? That we work with the neediest and most vulnerable Chicagoans. Everyone kind of deserves basic rights and dignity. So that compassion frame, which we found got you a charitable response, but didn't get you a structural response. But we did find that that saying we have untapped human potential, right? Everyone comes with great potential, and the way we support them, make sure, and the conditions around them, right? That's going to make sure whether or not that potential is available to our communities, to our civic life, to our social life, to our economic life. So here's an example of 4 different organizations doing very different work, sharing that values frame in different communications. So you can see Human Services Council in New York actually rewrote their mission statement to instead of saying we work with the vulnerable populations of like veterans and seniors and people with disabilities. Now they're saying people from all cross walks of life to make sure that they reach their full potential. This image here, the people on top of the cities, this is from the the Alliance for Strong Families and Communities. And I just love that it's got this victory pose, different bodies, right? Different kind of spaces. And it is very much a collective expression, right? That city underneath all the people, right? That is a collective action and common good frame, as well as this kind of potential sort of thing. A campaign, an anti-hunger campaign, which I tongue-in-cheek called Got Food, but it is the actual same photographer who did Got Milk, did this, and it's food fueled my promise. And so that promise and the promise of his potential is here, right? Not I was a sad kid that, woe is me, I got food stamps, but really that aspirational, I was able to fulfill my potential, right, because of that help. And then another one called the Possibility Project. So when I say go on repeat, it's this, again, what are these big ideas that we want to make ubiquitous and common sense in society that right now are there and available to be activated, but don't get the number of reps that consumerism and individualism and et cetera, capitalism do. All right, so that's my story and I'm sticking to it. We've got a lot of choices to make. When we do that, we need to make sure that we are organizing those choices into a narrative structure that lets people understand why we're doing this, what's going on, what's the problem, and what's the fix. Do not skimp on that process statement, right? Really explaining how something works has an outsized effect on how people how they get on board with solutions. And it's not just a narrative for one, for your next newsletter. This is something that needs to kind of arc across an organizational communications and across an issue like a coalition or a field's communications for the most powerful effect. That's what I got. What do you got? What do you want to talk about?
Let's open it up to questions. If folks want to just come off mute and ask a question or put it in the chat. I think that was incredible, Julie. Thank you for that overview.
There's a question in the chat, Julie, from Annette.
Yep. Annette. Okay.
Hi.
Asset framing. Oh, yes. I'm working right now on, okay, sorry. First of all, do you mean like asset versus deficit, or do you mean assets like wealth?
Asset versus deficit. So yeah, just like the language that we use. And I mean, I'm a woman of color, yet I've been raised in this society. So I also could do better when it comes to framing the language as not inclusive, but as, and I don't want to use the word empowering, but I can't think of another word. Hence why I need this glossary.
Yes, exactly. I don't know if I have a glossary. I am working on a module right now on inclusive language. We do have a style guide that we share that's for talking about people. It's not a complete style guide, but it's some of those things like, you probably already, know that it's person first language. Some of it's probably already in your vocabulary, but I think there are some good insights into it. I think this is, so the concept of attribution. Oh yeah, that's a good one too. Also Opportunity Agenda has a really nice one that they do. So thanks for sharing that, Emma. Thinking about where you attribute responsibility, I think, is a real big piece of asset-based framing that that often gets missed. So it's not enough to say, okay, we're going to call this group Black Americans or Latinx instead of African Americans or Hispanic, right? I mean, that's great. And we should pay attention to how groups want to be referred to. But if your overall frame is these folks are vulnerable because of risky behaviors, right? The fact that you just changed their name, right, doesn't really get to that structural issue. So I like to guide people on asset framings by giving them a set of words that if you're using these, you're probably using either a charity frame, with the worthy giving to the unworthy or the less than, or a blame frame, right? And so they are words like help, serve, vulnerable, assist. And so any of those are charity framing words. And if you force yourself to take those out, you usually have to attribute responsibility differently. So that's yeah, I don't have a handy checklist, but I will send along after this anything I do that kind of looks like that.
Which one did you mention just now that I didn't write down because I was paying attention to what you were saying?
The Opportunity Agenda, who does work similar to us. They do a little more on the like grassroots side and less on the research side than we do, but I think it's a very similar kind of perspective. And they've got a social justice language guide that has some of those sorts of things as well. I also said somebody asked about the slides. Yes, I will happily share them. And
we can send them out with the recording of the video to everybody post this event. Yeah, it'd be great. What other questions do you folks have for the few minutes left we have with Julie?
Or comments or
comments.
additions, right? Just things that this sparked for you and that sort of thing. It doesn't necessarily need to be a question. Yeah.
I guess I have a question about, you showed a couple of different slides that were the numbers behind your research. And I was having a hard time understanding, was it 1% to 3% difference? And then the other slide was more like 10 to 12% difference versus the control group. And I love your website and I love looking into the research whenever I'm framing a new issue. So if you could give us a little more insight in how to read that data, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. So, okay. So the way we do the experiments are, there's message conditions and typically a null, right? So a null condition, people get no message. Everyone typically, whether or not you were assigned to human potential or compassion, whatever you're reading, some groups would get nothing. They're all answering the same kind of survey questions. And the numbers are different across different experiments because we've used different scales, right? So in some of them, a 3% bump is like respectable for a microdose experiment, right? You're only getting people to see it one time and you're changing that, changing minds in that moment. Others are kind of forced choice sorts of things. So you tend to get you see bigger movement on those. So I don't have a nice, rule of thumb for you to see that. So the way we hold ourselves accountable is that we're always, making sure that those samples are well designed and have sufficient statistical power, and we are looking for statistical significance. And so that's why we're always careful to put that on there. But I wouldn't read too much into the fact that, on, I forget what all I showed, on oral health, we get a 3% bump, and on tobacco, we get 10, or something. Like that's more about the way the experiment was conducted than about comparing one issue to another. That we don't really have a way to get at that. So I'm sorry, that's probably a little bit of an unsatisfying answer, but it was a very good question. And thumbs up and +1 on being a critical consumer of communications advice.
There's a question in the chat. What are thoughts on accommodating donors versus sticking to values? Asset framing is defined by community, from Amy Paul.
That's a better version of that question than I often get. So thanks for that. Because it's usually, we know what we want to say, but our donors don't want to hear that. But I love that you've said it's as defined by community. I'll tell you what, here's what we found across 3 different experiments that we've done and a couple of interesting things. We believe that you can have your cake and eat it too on your donor communications, meaning when we have tested this, when we have tested head to head, kind of the traditional sob story, kind of sympathy frame, right, for a human service benefit recipient, our program saved this person kind of story, versus a more structural justice context story. We have always come within a few cents on the dollar to, if not slightly outperforming. The reframe does as well as, or slightly outperforms in some cases, the dominant frame. So for instance, and I can actually send you guys these 2 examples. A human services we did recently with they were doing a donor acquisition mailing. So they're sending this out to 20,000 people. They randomly assigned 10,000 on each, right, to get one of these letters. And when we talked about human services as the idea that nobody builds well-being on their own, it takes resources, it takes a team to construct well-being. And here's how our nonprofit kind of shored up the well-being of this particular family. And overall, we need to be doing more of this, versus kind of a more zoomed in story designed to pull at the heartstrings about that individual who is the example. We got more new donors with the structural framing and a higher initial donation, right, than there. So more donors and donors giving more in that particular recent experiment. So I think you should speak your values, and educate your donors rather than accommodate your donors. That by virtue of being your donors, they are already demonstrating that they're interested in the issue. And can you get them to both take the individual action to donate and be better ambassadors, give them better language for talking about the issue by telling a more structural story. That's what I think on that one. Yes, climate change, woohoo. We have on our website, frameworksinstitute.org, 99% of what we do is publicly available up on that website, and our climate change work is all. There are a couple issues like tobacco control and gun violence that we keep, we just hand out person to person for security reasons, but you can definitely look there. In terms of round of resources offered on our website. It's so good. Thank you. It is a very full digital space. That's what I'll say about that. There's lots there. So you can search it a couple different ways. You can go into issue and then just click on the issue and it will pull stuff up. You can do a search bar if you know exactly what you're looking for, but probably going to the issues tab is best. There's another good section there that's kind of like framing 101, and you can look for that. I would also say that if you sign up for our Frame On is our internal one. On Frame is the external newsletter. That's where you get updates and alerts when we've published new materials, which doesn't come out super often. I think we send it out once a month, but that will help you stay up to date on the latest. We've been doing this for 20 years. There are over 500 studies on that site right now. And they're not all studies. Some of them are more toolkits, right, with examples. So that's another place to search. Just go to the toolkits and see what we've got, where that's more like a quick start guide and frequently asked questions, which aren't questions you're asking about framing. They're like questions people in the field get and how to answer them, and critically how not to answer them. Different things like that. Videos, we've got online courses. So there's a lot there. All of us nerdy social scientists work at Frameworks and not at a university because we want to be nerds that make a difference and be much closer, right? Make it much more applied and useful for folks to give out. So hopefully, if you haven't visited yet, please do so.
Excellent. I see I think we've got time for one more question. There's a question in the chat from Allison. Any advice for framing when doing internal communications around DEI work at an organization?
Nope. I got no advice on that, except be nice.
Fair.
Sorry, it's just you. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. That's okay. Listen, Julie, thank you so much. This was really great. For everybody, thank you for joining. As a reminder, we've got Julie back again on May 19th at noon to talk about communications traps, that kind of next phase of this. How do you, what not to do, which I think will be great. Like we said, we're going to send around this recording. We're also going to gather the slides and any of these other resources that were talked about and send them out to everybody. And obviously go to the Frameworks website and stay in touch with ComNet. Thank you, Julie.
All right. Bye, Chicago. Thanks for joining. See you soon.
Thanks, everybody.